On a Saturday afternoon in June of 1975, in the showroom of Hollister Implement in Blue Earth, Minnesota, a man named Richard Hollister told his only son that he was dead to him. The showroom was full of customers that day. Farmers looking at new equipment, wives drinking coffee by the parts counter, kids running between the big green tractors. Everyone heard it. "You want to throw away everything I've built?" Richard's voice echoed off the polished concrete floor. "Everything my father built? For what? To play mechanic with some dirt farmer and his junkyard tractors?" David Hollister was 22 years old. He stood near the door, a duffel bag over his shoulder, grease still visible under his fingernails from that morning's work. He didn't raise his voice. "It's not about throwing anything away, Dad. It's about learning something real." "Real?" Richard laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You want to know what's real? This dealership does $2 million a year. $2 million. And you're walking out to go work for a man who can't afford to buy a new set of tires." Walt Erickson has forgotten more about engines than anyone in this showroom will ever know. Walt Erickson is a 68-year-old failure who farms 160 acres with equipment from the 1940s. He's a joke, David. And now you're going to be a joke, too. David looked at his father for a long moment. Richard Hollister was 54 years old, successful, respected, the third generation of his family to run the most profitable equipment dealership in Farmall County. He wore a suit to work every day. He hadn't turned a wrench in 20 years. "I'm sorry you see it that way," David said. "If you walk out that door, don't bother coming back. I mean it. You won't be my son anymore. You'll be nothing." David nodded once. Then he walked out. Behind him, he heard his mother crying. He heard his father shouting something else, something about ungrateful children and wasted opportunities. He heard the murmur of the customers, the whispers that would spread across the county by nightfall. He didn't look back. Now let me tell you how David Hollister ended up in that showroom, and why he made the choice that would define the rest of his life. David was born in 1953, the only child of Richard and Dorothy Hollister. From the day he could walk, everyone assumed he would take over the dealership. It was simply understood, the way the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. Richard made sure of it. Every summer from age 12 onward, David worked at Hollister Implement. He swept floors, stocked shelves, learned to write up sales orders, helped in the parts department. By the time he graduated high school, he knew the business from top to bottom, but he didn't love it. That was the thing nobody talked about. David did everything his father asked. He went to college for 2 years, business courses, accounting, marketing. He came back and worked full-time at the dealership, wearing a tie, learning to shake hands with the bankers and schmooze with the customers. He was good at it. He was good at everything he tried. But every day he felt like he was wearing someone else's life. The dealership sold new equipment, brand new John Deeres, straight from the factory, with warranties and financing plans and shiny green paint. Farmers would come in, sign the papers and drive away on tractors that cost more than most houses. And when those tractors broke down, which they rarely did at first, the dealership's service department would fix them. Quickly, efficiently, expensively. David understood the business model. He just didn't believe in it, because he'd noticed something that his father never seemed to see. The farmers who bought new equipment every few years, who always had the latest model, who financed everything through the dealership, those farmers were always stressed, always worried about payments, about interest rates, about whether next year's crop would cover this year's debt. But the farmers who kept their old equipment running, the ones who drove 30-year-old tractors and fixed them themselves, those farmers slept well at night. They didn't owe anyone anything. They weren't trapped. David started asking questions. He'd talk to the old-timers who came into the dealership, not to buy usually, just to look around, maybe pick up a part. He'd ask them how they kept their ancient machines running, what they'd learned over the decades, what they knew that the younger generation had forgotten. That's how he met Walt Erickson. Let me tell you about Walt, because without him, this story doesn't exist. Walter Erickson was 68 years old in He farmed 160 acres of marginal land about 12 miles outside of Blue Earth, land his father had homesteaded in 19. He had never married, never had children, never done much of anything except work his fields and keep his equipment running. His equipment was legendary in the county, but not in a good way. Walt drove a 1947 Farmall M that he'd bought new 28 years earlier. He had a 1952 Farmall Super C for lighter work. His combine was a 1958 Massey Harris that made sounds no machine should make, but somehow kept harvesting. Most people thought Walt was crazy, or stubborn, or just too poor to buy anything newer. They'd see him driving that old Farmall down the county road, smoke puffing from the stack, and they'd shake their heads. Richard Hollister called him the last dinosaur. But David saw something different. One afternoon in the spring of 1975, David was making a parts delivery to a farm near Walt's property when his truck broke down. He walked to the nearest place, which happened to be Walt's farm, to use the phone. He never made that phone call. What he found instead was a workshop unlike anything he'd ever seen. Walt had built it himself over 40 years. A long, low building with a dirt floor and wooden walls and every tool imaginable, most of them older than David. Inside were 3 tractors in various states of disassembly, plus an engine on a stand, plus what looked like an entire transmission spread across a workbench. Walt was sitting on an overturned bucket, machining a part on an ancient lathe. "Mr. Erickson," David said from the doorway. "I'm David Hollister. My truck broke down on the—" "I know who you are." Walt didn't look up from his work. "Richard's boy, the one who's going to take over the dealership." "Yes, sir. I was wondering if I could use your phone." "Phone's in the house. Help yourself." Walt kept working. The part he was making was small, precise, clearly requiring concentration. David should have gone to the house, called the dealership, had someone come pick him up. That's what he should have done. Instead, he asked, "What are you making?" Walt finally looked up. His eyes were sharp, assessing. "Governor shaft for a Farmall H. Haven't been able to get one from the factory in 15 years, so I make them myself." "You make your own parts?" "Make them, modify them, adapt them from other machines. Whatever it takes." Walt went back to his work. "Your father would say I'm wasting my time, says I should just buy a new tractor and stop living in the past. What do you say?" Walt smiled, a thin, weathered smile. "I say a man who depends on someone else to fix his equipment is a man who doesn't really own anything. He just borrows it until it breaks." David stood in that doorway for a long moment, watching Walt work. The lathe hummed. Metal shavings curled away from the part. Outside, a meadowlark was singing. And something shifted in David's chest, something he'd been feeling for years, without ever being able to name it. "Could you teach me?" he asked. Walt stopped the lathe. He looked at David again, longer this time. "Teach you what?" "Everything. How to make parts, how to keep old machines running, how to—" David struggled to find the words. How to really understand how things work, not just how to sell them. Walt was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your daddy's not going to like that." "No, sir, he's not." "You willing to pay that price?" David thought about the dealership, the ties, the handshakes, the life that had been planned for him since before he was born. He thought about how it felt to sell a farmer a tractor that cost more than the man's house, knowing that farmer would be paying it off for the next 10 years. "Yes, sir," he said. "I am." Walt nodded slowly. "Come back tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock. Wear clothes you don't mind ruining." David came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and every morning for the next 3 months before his shifts at the dealership, he drove out to Walt's farm and learned. Let me stop here and tell you what Walt taught David, because it wasn't just about machinery, it was about a whole philosophy of life. First, Walt taught him that every machine has a soul, a character, a personality, a way of telling you what it needs. You learn to listen to the way an engine runs, the vibrations in the frame, the small sounds that mean everything is fine or something is about to fail. Most people never hear these things. They just drive until something breaks, then call for help. Second, Walt taught him that knowledge is more valuable than equipment. A man with an old tractor and real skills will outwork a man with a new tractor and no understanding. Because the new tractor will break eventually, everything does, and when it does, the man with the skills will fix it himself, while the other man waits for the dealer, pays the dealer, depends on the dealer. Third, and most important, Walt taught him that independence is the only real security. Banks can take your land, markets can crash, equipment can fail, but knowledge, real, deep, hard-won knowledge, can never be taken from you. A man who truly understands his machines, his land, his work, can survive anything. Your father sells dependency, Walt said one afternoon, as they rebuilt a carburetor together. Every farmer who finances a new tractor becomes dependent on the dealer to fix it, dependent on the bank to pay for it, dependent on the market to make enough to cover the payments. That's not farming, that's sharecropping with extra steps. David didn't argue. He was starting to see things the same way. By June of 1975, David had made his decision. He quit his job at the dealership and went to work for Walt full-time. No salary, just room and board, plus whatever Walt could teach him. That's what led to the confrontation in the showroom. That's what led to Richard Hollister disowning his only son in front of half the county. And that's where the real story begins. Now I need to tell you about the next 10 years, because those years are what turned David Hollister from a dropout into a legend. He lived in a small room in Walt's farmhouse, barely bigger than a closet, with a single window that looked out over the equipment barn. He ate what Walt ate, worked when Walt worked, learned everything the old man was willing to teach. And Walt was willing to teach a lot. They started with the basics: how engines work, how transmissions work, how hydraulics and electrical systems and fuel injection all fit together. Then they moved to the harder stuff: diagnosing problems by sound, fabricating parts from scratch, adapting components from one machine to fit another. David had a gift for it. His hands, which had spent years pushing papers and shaking hands, turned out to be steady and precise. His mind, trained in business school to think about profits and margins, adapted easily to the mechanical logic of cause and effect. By the end of the first year, David could tear down and rebuild any Farmall engine blind. By the end of the second year, he was doing jobs that even Walt admitted he couldn't do anymore. His hands too stiff, his eyes too weak for the finest work. Word spread, the way it does in farm country. At first it was just the neighbors, farmers who knew Walt, who trusted him, who were willing to give the Hollister boy a chance. They'd bring their old equipment to Walt's barn, and David would fix it, cheap, fast, right the first time. Then it was farmers from farther away, men who'd heard about the kid who could make a 1948 Farmall run like new, men who couldn't afford dealership prices, couldn't afford new equipment, couldn't afford to be dependent. By 1978, David and Walt had more work than they could handle. They hired a helper, a young farmer named Carl who'd lost his land in a foreclosure and needed work. Then another helper, then another. They weren't getting rich. They charged fair prices, not dealership prices. But they were surviving, and more importantly, they were helping others survive. The 1980s came, and with them, the worst agricultural crisis since the Depression. If you've heard our other stories, you know what happened. Interest rates spiked, land values collapsed, grain prices fell through the floor. Farmers who had borrowed during the boom years found themselves underwater, owing more than their farms were worth. The auctions started By 1983, they were happening every week. By 1985, they were happening every day. And something interesting happened to Hollister Implement. The farmers who had bought new equipment during the good years, the ones who had financed through the dealership, who had signed up for the maintenance plans, who had trusted Richard Hollister's advice, those farmers were the first to go under. Their payments were too high. Their equipment was too expensive to maintain. When the banks called in the loans, they had nothing left. But the farmers who had kept their old equipment running, the ones who had brought their Farmalls and their Olivers and their Massey Fergusons to Walt's barn for repairs, Those farmers survived. Not comfortably, but they survived. They owed less. They could fix things themselves. They weren't dependent on anyone. By 1985, Hollister Implement was in trouble. Richard Hollister had built his business on a simple model: sell new equipment, finance it through the dealership's credit arm, make money on the sale and on the interest and on the service contracts. It worked beautifully when farmers were flush with cash and confident about the future. But when the crisis hit, farmers stopped buying new equipment. The ones who had bought during the boom couldn't make their payments, and when they defaulted, the dealership was stuck with used tractors it couldn't resell. The service department sat empty because nobody could afford repairs at dealership rates. By the spring of 1985, Richard Hollister owed the bank more than $400,000. His credit lines were maxed out. His inventory was worthless. His customers were gone. The bank gave him 60 days to come up with a plan, or they would foreclose on everything. The dealership, the inventory, even the house. Richard Hollister was 64 years old. He had been in the equipment business for 40 years, and he had no idea what to do. Now here's where I need to tell you about something that happened in 1982, 3 years before the crisis reached its peak. Walt Erickson died. He was 75 years old. His heart gave out while he was working in the barn, doing what he loved. David found him the next morning, slumped over a workbench, a half-finished repair still in front of him. Walt had never married, never had children of his own, but in his will he left everything to David Hollister. The farm, the equipment, the workshop, the tools, everything. "You're the son I never had," the will said. "You learned what I had to teach. Now teach others." David was 29 years old when Walt died. He'd been working with the old man for 7 years. He'd learned more than he ever imagined possible, and suddenly he was alone. He could have sold the farm. The land was worth something, even in a bad market. He could have taken the money, moved away, started over somewhere nobody knew his name or his father's name. Instead, he kept the workshop open. He hired more helpers. He took on more work. He started teaching younger men, and a few women, the skills Walt had taught him. By 1985, David Hollister was running the largest independent repair operation in southern Minnesota, with 6 employees and customers from 4 counties. He still charged fair prices. He still fixed things right the first time. He still believed what Walt had taught him, that independence was the only real security and knowledge was the only thing that couldn't be taken away. And he still hadn't spoken to his father in 10 years. Let me tell you how Richard Hollister ended up in his son's workshop on a Tuesday afternoon in May of 19... Richard had tried everything else first. He'd gone to the banks, all of them, every bank in 3 counties. Nobody would lend to a failing equipment dealer in the middle of a farm crisis. He'd tried to sell the dealership, but there were no buyers. He'd tried to sell the inventory, but nobody wanted new equipment they couldn't afford to operate. He'd even called John Deere headquarters in Moline, hoping they might help one of their longest-running dealers survive the crisis. They sent a polite letter expressing sympathy and noting that they were not in a position to provide financial assistance at this time. Richard Hollister was out of options. His wife, Dorothy, was the one who suggested it. "Go see David," she said. "He's your son. Whatever happened between you, he's still your son." "He's not my son. I told him that 10 years ago. You were angry. You were wrong. And now you need help." Dorothy looked at her husband with the kind of love that survives decades of marriage, including the hardest parts. "Swallow your pride, Richard. Go see your boy." Richard drove out to the old Erickson place on a Tuesday afternoon. He'd never been there before, had deliberately avoided that part of the county for years, not wanting to see his son's new life, not wanting to admit that David might have been right. What he found shocked him. The workshop had expanded. There were 3 buildings now, all full of equipment in various stages of repair. There were trucks parked outside, cars, tractors waiting for service. There was a sign by the road, "Erickson Hollister Repair. If it runs, we fix it." Richard parked his Cadillac. He still drove a Cadillac, even though he couldn't really afford it anymore, and walked toward the main building. David was inside, working on a John Deere 4. He looked up when his father walked in, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Richard had expected David to look different, poorer, maybe, worn down by 10 years of hard labor. But David looked good, strong, confident, calm. There was gray in his hair now. He was 32, but he carried himself like a man who knew exactly who he was. "Dad," David said. Not hostile, just neutral. "David." Richard's voice cracked slightly. He hadn't expected that. "I heard about the dealership, I'm sorry."
Are you?
David set down his wrench. "Yeah, I am. It was your life's work, Grandpa's life's work. I know what that means to you." Richard looked around the workshop, at the tools, the equipment, the employees working on their own projects, at everything his son had built after walking away from everything Richard had offered. "I need help," Richard said. The words cost him more than anything he'd ever said. "I don't know what else to do. The bank's going to take everything, and I can't." He stopped. His voice was shaking. David watched his father for a long moment. This was the man who had called him a disgrace, who had told him, in front of customers and employees and friends, that he was no longer a son, who had refused to speak to him for a decade. And now that man was standing in David's workshop, asking for help. David could have said no. He would have been justified. Nobody in the county would have blamed him. But Walt's voice echoed in his memory, something the old man had said years ago. A man's character isn't measured by how he treats people who can help him. It's measured by how he treats people who can't. Richard Hollister couldn't help David. Not anymore. He had nothing to offer except his need. "Sit down, Dad," David said. "Tell me everything." They talked for 3 hours. Richard explained the finances, the debt, the inventory, the credit lines, the bank's deadline. He explained the deals that had gone bad, the customers who had defaulted, the market that had collapsed. He held nothing back. When he was finished, David was quiet for a long time. "The dealership model is broken," David finally said. "You can't fix it by doing the same thing you've always done, selling new equipment to farmers who can't afford it, financing it at rates they can't sustain. That's what got everyone into this mess." "Then what do I do?" David stood up. He walked to the window, looking out at the equipment yard. "You do what I did, what Walt taught me. You stop selling dependency and start selling independence." "I don't understand." "Used equipment, Dad. Refurbished, rebuilt, good as new but at a fraction of the cost. Parts and repairs instead of replacements. Teaching farmers how to maintain their own machines instead of making them dependent on service contracts." David turned back to face his father. "The farmers who are surviving this crisis, they're not the ones with new John Deeres. They're the ones with old Farmalls that they can fix themselves. If you want to survive, you need to serve those farmers, not the ones who want the newest and the best, but the ones who want reliable and affordable and fixable." Richard shook his head. "The franchise agreement with John Deere. Cancel it. You're losing money on it anyway. Use the showroom for rebuilt equipment. Use the service bay for teaching maintenance classes. Use your parts inventory to keep old machines running instead of pushing new ones. That's the opposite of everything I've built." "Yes," David said, "it is." Richard sat in silence for a long moment. Everything David was describing went against 40 years of his life, against his father's legacy, against everything he believed about the business. But he was out of options, and his son was offering him the only life raft in sight. "Would you help me?" Richard asked. "Would you come back, show me how to do this?" David looked at his father. 10 years of silence, 10 years of rejection, and now in his father's darkest moment, a chance to be a son again. "I'll help you," David said, "but I'm not coming back to work for you. We'd be partners, equal partners. And we do things my way." Richard Hollister was not a man who shared control easily. He had run his business alone for decades, made every decision himself, answered to no one. But that business was dying, and his son was offering to save it. "Partners," Richard said. "Equal partners." They shook hands. It was the first time they had touched in 10 years. Let me jump forward now, because the next 3 years were about hard work and transformation, not dramatic confrontations. Richard and David restructured everything. They canceled the John Deere franchise, which cost them a significant penalty, but freed them from the obligations that were bleeding money. They converted the showroom into a used equipment depot, filled with refurbished tractors and implements that David and his team had rebuilt. They turned the service department into a teaching center, offering classes on basic maintenance and repair. They kept the Hollister name, but they added something to it: Hollister Implement and Repair, keeping farmers running since 19. The first year was brutal. Old customers, loyal to the John Deere brand, went elsewhere. The bank watched nervously, ready to foreclose at the first sign of trouble. Richard had to sell his Cadillac and start driving a 10-year-old pickup. But slowly, things began to turn. The farmers who were surviving the crisis, the careful ones, the debt-free ones, the ones who knew how to work with their hands, those farmers started coming to Hollister. They bought refurbished equipment at prices they could actually afford. They took maintenance classes and learned to do their own repairs. They told their neighbors, by the end of 1986, Hollister Implement was breaking even. By the end of 1987, it was profitable. By 1988, it was the most successful equipment business in Farmall County. Not the biggest, but the most stable, the most trusted, the most likely to survive whatever came next. And something else changed during those years. Something more important than the business. Richard and David started talking, not just about work, about everything. About the 10 years they'd lost. About the things Richard had said in that showroom, and why he'd said them. About what David had learned from Walt, and why it mattered. About fathers and sons, and the complicated ways we fail each other and find our way back. Richard admitted he'd been wrong. Not just about disowning David, about everything. About what success really meant. About what made a man valuable. About what mattered in the end. "I spent my whole life selling new equipment," Richard said one evening, as they sat on the porch of the old farmhouse that David still called home. "Making farmers think they needed the newest, the biggest, the most expensive, and all along the answer was the opposite. The answer was learning to keep what you have running." David didn't say, "I told you so." He just nodded. "Walt was right," Richard continued. "The man I called a dinosaur, a failure, a joke, he understood something I never did. Independence is the only real security, and knowledge is worth more than any piece of equipment in any showroom anywhere." He looked at his son, this man he had rejected, dismissed, disowned. "You were right to walk away. I was wrong to let you go." David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You didn't let me go, Dad. You told me to go. There's a difference." "I know, and I've regretted it every day for 10 years. "I know you have." David reached over and put his hand on his father's shoulder. "But I'm here now. We're here now. That's what matters." Richard Hollister died in 1994, at the age of 73. By then, he had spent 9 years working alongside his son, learning things he'd never thought to learn, building something more valuable than anything he'd built before. The business they created together is still running today. David's son, Richard's grandson, named Walter after the man who taught David everything, runs it now. They still sell refurbished equipment. They still teach maintenance classes. They still believe that independence is the only real security. And in the lobby of the shop, there's a framed photograph on the wall. It shows 3 men standing in front of an old Farmall M, Walt Erickson, David Hollister, and Richard Hollister. The photo was taken in 1987, 2 years after Richard swallowed his pride and asked his son for help. Underneath the photograph, there's a small plaque with words that Walt used to say, "A man who depends on someone else to fix his equipment is a man who doesn't really own anything. He just borrows it until it breaks." And below that, added after Richard died, "A man who can't admit he was wrong doesn't really own his own life either. He just borrows it until the truth catches up." RH, 1985. Let me leave you with this. In 1975, Richard Hollister looked at his son and saw a failure. A boy who had rejected everything his family had built. A disgrace to the Hollister name. What he couldn't see, what it took him 10 years and a crisis to understand, was that David hadn't rejected anything worth keeping. He had simply recognized, earlier than his father, that the world was changing, that the old model of selling dependency was dying, that the farmers who would survive the coming storm were the ones who knew how to take care of themselves. David didn't walk away from his father's legacy. He walked toward a different kind of legacy, one built on knowledge instead of sales, on independence instead of dependency, on the quiet satisfaction of keeping old machines running instead of the flashy pride of selling new ones. And in the end, that legacy saved the very business his father thought he was destroying. So the next time someone tells you you're making a mistake, the next time someone says you're throwing away your future, disgracing your family, walking away from everything that matters, ask yourself this: are they seeing clearly, or are they just seeing what they've always seen? Unable to imagine that the world might be different than they thought. David Hollister saw something his father couldn't see. It cost him 10 years of silence. It cost him his place in his family. It cost him everything he was supposed to inherit. But it also saved him. And eventually it saved his father too. Because sometimes the only way to honor a legacy is to let it go. And sometimes the only way to find your family is to leave them first. That Farmall M, the one David was working on the day his father disowned him, is still in the shop. David's grandson restored it a few years ago, the same way David once learned to restore old engines in Walt's barn. It runs as well now as it did in 19. Some things, if you take care of them, last forever. And some relationships, if you give them enough time, find their way back. Even when it takes 10 years. Even when it takes a crisis. Even when everyone says it's impossible. Never bet against a man who knows how to fix things. He might just fix you too.